Welcome to Future Knowledge, a podcast about knowledge, creativity, and policy, brought to you by the Internet Archive and Authors Alliance. We tend to think of the digital world as permanent. Who hasn't heard or said, once something's online, it's there forever? But what if the opposite is true? What if the websites, the stories, the music, and the films that define our culture are actually becoming more fragile over time? As we've shifted from analog to digital, something fundamental has changed. Increasingly, our cultural record lives on platforms we don't control. We no longer own our media. We access it, we stream it, we license it. We're no longer building media archives. We're just renting it from our corporate landlords. So if we don't own our culture, can we still preserve it? Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Freeland. I'm a librarian at the Internet Archive, and I'm also one of the editors of today's book. To explore these timely questions about cultural loss, the Internet Archive has published a new book, Vanishing Culture, a report on our fragile cultural record. It looks at what's at risk and what it will take to ensure our digital heritage doesn't simply disappear. Today, you'll hear from Luca Messarra, the report's lead author, and Katie Livingston, who contributed an essay on why preservation matters about a media type that's near and dear to her heart. You'll also hear from me as we talk through the ideas behind the book and what's at stake. And here to help kick things off is Dave Hansen, the executive director of Authors Alliance, who is going to guide today's conversation. Over to you, Dave.
Thanks, Chris. And hi, Luca and Katie. We're so happy to have you today and really looking forward to this conversation. This Vanishing Culture edition has been so impactful. I've seen people talking about it and interested in the variety of different ways that Vanishing Culture gets at a real phenomenon that I think we all sort of have experienced in real life, but haven't had someone sort of pull all of the pieces together. So I'm really happy that you wrote this. I was going to tell you it's one of my favorite recent books, but it's actually not my favorite because it tells such a sad story. If it wasn't so sad, it would be higher on the list. But I think naming the problem is the first step to coming up with a solution. So this is going to be very conversational. So just jump in on any of these questions. But I thought, Luca, I'd start off with you to just give us like a explanation of what is vanishing culture. Like, what is the book speaking to at this moment in time?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. First off, I'm so flattered that you said that this was almost your favorite book. I do think that there's hope in there, and I hope that we're going to talk about some of that hope later on in this podcast. But to kind of kick things off, so what is vanishing culture? So vanishing culture is a very big umbrella term, and it can refer to different phenomenon. And mostly what I want to do right now is talk about what I specifically mean when I refer to vanishing culture. So I think of vanishing culture as the premature disappearance of culture and information from public access. And I think of it as premature, not because I think that there's some ideal time for culture to disappear. In fact, it's very hard to say that there's an ideal moment for anything to disappear, but because I think of it as a sort of early loss of a work that is being driven by things like media decay, by malicious actors who are trying to rewrite history, by cost-saving moves and profit motivations by corporations, and a regulatory environment that is really hostile to the function of libraries in the digital age. These are all a bunch of complex mechanisms that I'm sure we'll talk about more in depth over the course of this podcast, but collaboratively, they cause culture and information to vanish seemingly at a whim. So it helps to kind of ground this with a couple of examples. First off, I think one of the big drivers of this is that we don't actually own our media anymore, as Chris said. So I was just having a fun conversation with somebody yesterday about the vanishing culture phenomenon, and he was talking about how he hit buy now on Amazon, and he can't actually access the thing anymore on Amazon, and he was really frustrated by it. That's because you only license and stream these things from Amazon. You don't actually own the file themselves. Another example of vanishing culture is when a company like Disney makes a television series like the Aladdin TV series. I don't know if any listeners are familiar with this. So Disney created an Aladdin TV series in the mid 90s and it ran up through the 2000s. It was on television and it was streaming on television, but Disney only released maybe like 18 of those episodes on VHS and DVD, and none of the episodes are available on Disney Plus. That means that most of that show is no longer available to be seen online. We have no idea why that is. So perhaps Disney is saving Aladdin because they want to make a lot of money in 40 and 50 years by releasing some nostalgia bit. Perhaps they don't want to release the show because maybe it was abetting in stereotypes of the Middle East. Aladdin was notorious for that. or, maybe they just don't want to spend the money on releasing the show again. So this is like a sort of peak example of vanishing culture where like something will disappear and there's complex reasons as to why that is.
So one piece of this that is just very real to me. I mean, I was librarian for many years and would sit at the reference desk and get questions from people and have this real world experience of like that thing that you know exists or knew existed at one point in time is just not there anymore. And I can't help you find it. And there's like nothing that I can do about it. So I have kind of a very academic perspective on trying to track down citations and find things. But one of the cool things I thought about this report is that you not only go into like the policy and those kind of pieces, but also just the real like human part of this. And so, Katie, you wrote an essay in here that really resonated, I think, with a lot of people. So, could you just tell us a little bit about what you wrote and why you wrote it and some of the reaction that you've seen?
Yeah, so I was asked to write an essay kind of broadly about cookbooks and why preserving cookbooks is important, which I mean, I think that like at a base level is great, but it sort of morphed into something a little bit more specific. So kind of like similarly to what Luca was talking about with animation and cartoons, there's this phenomena where, I mean, your example is from Disney, but like the big production companies like Disney, those things will be a little bit more accessible. Whereas I remember several cartoons from my childhood that were just kind of smaller or like not as popular and they just kind of vanish. Or maybe there's like one copy and like some YouTuber will have a copy of it and they'll make like a hour-long video essay, and that's kind of the only way that you have access to this thing. So similarly for cookbooks, you have kind of the bigger names. Like you have the Better Homes and Gardens cookbooks, which have guided home ec classes for a really long time. And then you have like your Betty Crocker, you have your mass produced cookbooks, and these there's just more copies in existence and more circulation of them. But one cookbook that was really close to me is my grandma had this cookbook called Down Home Cookin'. And such a generic name. And it's actually a homemaker's county extension cookbook. And I had grown up with this cookbook, and looking deeper into it, I sort of realized, oh, it doesn't have the same scope, as one of these mass produced cookbooks. And the copy that she had was so trodden over with just like stains and annotations. And she had ripped out pieces of magazines and even pages from the bigger cookbooks and kind of like interspersed it so it became its own thing. So my essay primarily focuses on her cookbook as an entry point, but also focuses on the Internet Archive's existing collection of cookbooks, which does have many of these regional or church based cookbooks or just community cookbooks, which are such fragile kind of domestic objects. And I think we see this a lot with things that are associated with domestic work or women's work in particular is they have such a high use value, like an everyday use value, that they don't reach the status of like high cultural object, and then we lose them. So this is kind of the premise behind my essay. And yeah, it really resonated with people because people, they love grandma's cookbook as a concept. So I think I was really excited to see the response to it.
I love it. It reminded me of I have a cookbook that I bought at a used bookstore, and I brought it home and it had all these annotations just like the one that you talked about. And my favorite was it had one recipe that was like scratched out so much you couldn't even see it, and it just said "never again" next to it. And I've always
Yeah.
wondered, like, what was the story behind what happened with that recipe?
Yeah, it's so funny because you would think that, the annotations would be for like positive things, but a lot of them are just like, no, not this one, or they're like modifications because the original recipe kind of sucked.
One of the things I love so much about what you just said, Katie, and your essay in general, is that it captures the importance of subcultural expression in this issue of vanishing culture. So we can trust that something like Taylor Swift will probably make it through like the life plus 70 years copyright that she has over her works. But that might not be the case for smaller publications that might only be available temporarily on streaming platforms. And then when they're no longer popular anymore, companies will take them down. So Paramount, for example, infamously took down the Comedy Central website, and that caused a lot of the early Colbert Report episodes, the Jon Stewart episodes, to simply just disappear. That's bad for academic scholarship because academics can no longer access and study these works, but it's also bad for people who are just generally fans of these shows. They won't be able to access them anymore and they won't be able to use them. And libraries can't do anything about it because there's no physical releases of these media. So at the core of like the issue of vanishing culture is making sure that all different types of cultural expression have an opportunity to make it into the public record.
I'd like to throw in on that. I mean, I think Luca is spot on in that assessment. And I think one of the reasons why Katie's essay really just connected with people is because it's so real. Like, I think many of us come from a cooking tradition or have grown up around food. I know for me personally, I grew up like my mom was an excellent cook, my grandmother was an excellent cook. The story that Katie told about the well-worn recipe, the book with the pages with the grease stains, like that was my shared experience as well. I could picture that as I was reading Katie's words, like I have lived through that essay. And so it really resonated with me. It was like I saw myself in what Katie was writing. And I think that because we have such a strong food culture in certain ways in the United States. There's that strong connection between nostalgia and food, especially, but it's interesting that there's this connection between like nostalgia and the ephemerality of these cookbooks, especially like the pamphlet cookbooks, like the county extension. I grew up in a Protestant tradition. I went to a Methodist church, and like every year there was the ladies' auxiliary cookbook that was produced with, Mrs. So and so's Spanish cream pie recipe. Like those were just around me as I was growing up, and I never thought about their importance until I moved into an online world where there's absolutely no way of me finding Mrs. Stevenson's Spanish cream pie recipe because I doubt that that has been digitized and it's not available. And so, like, these things that were like treasured parts of my culture as I was growing up are just not available to me anymore because they've been kind of lost to time. And I wonder, Katie, like, are you finding that in your work and in your studies on this topic?
Yeah, well, it's funny that you mentioned that because after doing this project, I've sort of started collecting these more widely. And if you look, they're all over just used bookstores and even thrift stores. Cookbooks are one of the biggest, I think, refused books in existence because they're so popular. So many are printed. But then in particular, these little community ones. And I was actually searching for a particular one because I was writing an essay about one of the towns I grew up in, Medicine Park, here in Oklahoma, which has a crazy history. And I wanted to find a particular church cookbook that I knew existed. So I reached out to the church, and of course, they don't have any like record of it, or they don't have any copies of it left. So the only way to sort of hunt it down in that case would be to try and look at their members and like call around. So that just gives you kind of a hint at how both ubiquitous and rare these items are. And I think that that's like a really interesting cultural product. And there's probably many such cases of things that are in their individual instance very rare. And yet, as you were saying, Chris, we're so like entrenched in them. They're so around us that we consider them so ubiquitous and therefore don't preserve them. And I also think that it calls into question about what institutions are these things housed in? Who can we rely on to preserve them? Because a church is performing a really important, like significant community service, but being a library is not necessarily one of them, even though maybe they try. And those are like, I think, important niches maybe for some place like the Internet Archive to step in and do a little bit of work of helping to preserve.
Well, like I said at the beginning, I think part of the work is naming some of the problem, and I think that Vanishing Culture, the book, does that. So, Chris, maybe you could talk a little bit about just how this book came about.
Sure. Yeah. So let's jump into a time machine and go back to 2024. So I somehow have found myself to be heavily involved with the Internet Archive social media apparatus and our media channels. And so what I noticed at that time as I was putting out posts about preservation and these issues of cultural loss, that when we would talk about these issues online, people would really respond to them. We would get lots of likes, we'd get lots of engagement, we'd get lots of conversation from people about, if we talked about a particular media type like Flash software, then people would tell us about all their memories of how they interacted with a particular game or a particular website. And, that was all meaningful, but we saw that there was a bigger problem and we wanted to kind of name it and describe it. And we wanted something that we could point to at the end of a URL that would try to bring these ideas around vanishing culture together. And so in the spring of 2024, I started working along with Leela Bailey, one of the policy counsels at the Internet Archive, of looking for who could we find to help us write this out. We knew that we were maybe a little too inside of this to really see it fairly. And so we needed someone with an external perspective to write about these issues. And so through a couple of relationships, we found Luca and had like in the immediate first chat. I mean, I think we were talking for maybe 3 minutes and I was already slacking, typing out a message to Leela in Slack, like, yep. This is the person that we want to write this. It was just so very clear that Luca had a strong point of view and like understood these issues as a humanities scholar. And that's really what we were wanting to do with this work. I have read countless reports on preservation and the challenges that face libraries and archives in trying to archive materials. And they always come from either a technology perspective or from this like library and archival perspective. But we wanted something different. We wanted a humanities person to look at what does this mean for our culture that I no longer have access to the media that I listen to, that like, I used to buy CDs or tapes or 8 tracks or LPs, and now I'm just streaming stuff on Spotify and I'm just renting it. I'm just leasing temporary access to it. So we said Luca is the right person, and to kind of round out the stories, to give multiple inputs for our audience, we wanted to do a part 2 to the book that had essays from scholars and interesting people talking about the things that they're passionate about, like Katie talking about cookbooks, like Rick Pralinger talking about why home movies on film are important, like Jason Scott talking about why software preservation, especially of Flash, is important. So we worked over the summer of 2024 and put that work together. Luca did an amazing job. And as we were going to print in 2024 with what we were calling the report, we decided we just wanted to put a PDF out because we wanted to get the information out. We didn't want to put a book together. That's when the Internet Archive suffered a major DDoS attack. And so at the time that we were publishing the book, we had a real world example of Vanishing Culture about these cyber attacks that were cutting off access to one of the largest digital libraries in the world. So the timing couldn't have been better and worse at the same time. Flash forward, we started putting out the essays, as we talked about with Katie, putting those out on social media, people getting a big response. And so what we heard all along that way for the past 18 months, almost 2 years, people have said, this is great, but I want it in the book form. I want to be able to buy this. I want to put it on my shelf. So we went through the process of taking that report, making it into a book, adding in a couple more essays and kind of freshening up the text with what you can now go and either download for free and read at the Internet Archive or purchase from your favorite bookstore.
Well, so I want to continue the timeline theme because like you brought us almost up to the present, at least, well, you brought us up to the present in terms of how the book came together. But obviously, like the world moves pretty fast, and 2026 looks a lot different than 2024 in a number of ways. And so maybe we could talk just a little bit about like what are the new developments that we see affecting access and preservation of culture today?
I think the one that I'm certainly the most familiar with, because it's happening as we're recording this and will still be news as this makes its way out onto the podcast, is that major publishers have started blocking the Wayback Machine. So no longer, the Wayback Machine has been operating for 30 years. And starting in February of this year, there were news stories coming out about how the New York Times, the Guardian, Reddit, and some other places have blocked the Wayback Machine, either or, from either indexing the content and stopping us from making it available for people to browse online. And so what seemed like a scary possibility as we were putting the work together in 2024 became very much a real issue for us today in 2026. And so this issue has gotten a lot of engagement, a lot of eyes, a lot of people are talking about this because there was a very popular Wired article that came out recently highlighting this. And, it's wonderful to read the support that the Wayback Machine has received at this moment in time across social media from journalists, Rachel Maddow, Kate Nibbs at Wired, like amazing support. But along the way, everyone's still asking us, so what can we do? And it's hard because in this particular case, there isn't really a great answer of what we can do, what any individual can do to change this. This is just sort of corporate actions, corporations being corporations. I don't know, Luca,
Yeah.
I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I'll throw in a couple things about like what people can do. We live in a political moment right now where the president of the United States can post a picture of himself appearing as Jesus Christ, as it just happened a couple of days ago, and then delete it from his Truth Social a couple of days later, and then claims that he was actually depicting himself as a doctor. And the only reason why we know, but that's not true, is because a ton of people have taken screenshots of that picture of that. I was about to say Blue Sky, but it wasn't a Blue Sky post of that Truth Social post, and they've shared it online. So to me, like the stakes of like more and more people being citizen journalists, of recording the things that governments are doing, that politicians are doing, and sharing them online have only increased. So if you're a person who cares about these things, recording things, taking pictures, posting them online, to me, that's one way to get around the issue of like stuff that the Wayback Machine might miss, is if people are just doing it and posting it online on their own.
Yeah, to me, the obvious is we had AI rumbling around in 2024, but since then, I mean, there's like 100 copyright AI lawsuits in the United States right now, and there is no end in sight. I mean, these things are not going to get resolved for the next decade plus. And, preservation and access to culture isn't necessarily AI related, but we're starting to see like these collateral damage effects from these lawsuits, and it's really impacting libraries and archives in a lot of different ways. I mean, I think we're starting to see a number of libraries that have digital repositories that are basically being taken down because the bot traffic is so significant. But then on the other side of it, we see publishers and other big rights holders filing really big and consequential lawsuits that are not just dealing with AI, but kind of the broader issue of who gets access to information. So, like, one example, something that was not on my bingo card for 2025 was seeing a lawsuit filed by Google objecting to web scraping. And the irony is pretty obvious there, but it just shows you like how far that window has shifted. And if we now have the world's largest web scraper arguing that web scraping is illegal because of a variety of, under that case, it was a DMCA violation allegation. That doesn't bode well for, organizations like the Internet Archive or, I mean, smaller institutions, certainly.
Yeah, Dave, I think the phrase that we've heard specific to the Wayback Machine, but generally around libraries, is that libraries are collateral damage in the AI wars that are happening right now, both from the takedowns that are happening from the Internet Archive, the infrastructure challenges that you described. All of us who work in libraries, we want open data to be available openly, and we want it to be used, which means that, yeah, sure, AI should get at the public domain materials that are in our collections, but please don't take us down in the process. Don't kick the library offline in your enthusiasm to get at the material that the library makes available. Like, that's just being a bad bad citizen online. And it doesn't help librarians and scholars who really kind of want to support the idea of text and data mining, when there are those kinds of bad corporate actors.
I have a question that I'd like to kind of throw in there, and I'm curious. So when we released this report, right before it was released, there was a major DDoS attack on the Internet Archive, and I'm wondering if similar sorts of things have come up in the last couple of years, either with the Internet Archive or with other digital repositories, where they faced attacks by malicious actors.
I think the most prominent example I know of besides the Internet Archive is the British Library, which had a pretty significant attack. And I do think it's worth differentiating, like, and Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding of what happened with IA was like it was a real DDoS attack. It
Yeah.
wasn't just a kind of over enthusiastic hug of death from, a bunch of bots that were trying to scrape all at the same time, right?
No, no, no. This was definitely an attack.
And this is where the notion of shared custodianship, I think, is really important. And it's something that I talk a little bit about in the report. It's really important that both we have institutions and individuals that can collaborate together to preserve stuff. So Katie talked about like the example of like a church holding cookbooks, but also the Internet Archive has cookbooks at the exact same time. That's one thing that people could do, is like having things in many different places is one of the best antidotes to the issue of vanishing culture.
Well, one thing we kind of skipped over a little bit here, but I'd like to go back to is the idea of platforms. So much content is hosted, shared on platforms now. And I understand there's this Pew report coming soon here that deals with that and talks a little bit about like the number of web pages that have disappeared and things like that. So I'd love to hear a little bit more of some of the findings there and how that relates to some of the essays in Vanishing Culture.
Yeah, so I read about this Pew report that came out, I believe, in 2024. And the report, what it did is it collected a bunch of web pages from 2013 up to 2024. And what they discovered was that around 38% of the web pages that they sampled no longer were accessible an entire decade later. So it had only been 10 years, and they were no longer able to access 38% of those web pages. That sounds really, really horrible until Mark Graham, director of the Wayback Machine, and Saul Alam, who also works at the Wayback Machine, they did a test where they took those original web pages that Pew reported as lost, and they checked to see how many of those are backed up in the Wayback Machine. And they discovered that 62% of those links that were purportedly lost are actually preserved in the Wayback Machine at least once. So that's an example of like the supreme importance of web archiving and of the Wayback Machine, because there's very few, I don't know, really any substantial alternative to the Wayback Machine out there. But at the same time, Mark Graham and Sue Lum, as I'm sure they'll talk about in the article, they recognize that not every single one of those links is preserved by the Wayback Machine. So there's still like the 38% or something like that that isn't there. So there's always more work to be done. And the stakes of this are really important. They extend beyond just entertainment. So there was an interesting report that I wrote about, I believe it was a 2014 report on Supreme Court documents, and it was talking about link rot Supreme Court documents. And what they discovered is something like 50% of the URLs that are linked in Supreme Court case decisions, they're broken, or they don't point to the exact same information that they used to. And that's horrible for legal precedent and for being able to go back and to check the validity of information. So it extends well beyond the ability of somebody to just kind of like have fun messing around on MTV. It extends into like, how do we function as a civilization today in the digital age?
If I remember correctly, when that report came out, somebody had gone to the effort of buying the domain name that was linked in a Supreme Court opinion and then posting a thing that said, if you were Justice Breyer when you wrote this link into your opinion, you would have found a different page. But now I'm pointing out the problems of link rot. And I mean that's pretty dangerous, the idea that we have Supreme Court opinions relying on public information sources that can change underneath them.
I was going to throw in, I think Luca hit on something important where, so I think when we talk about, hey, link rot in Supreme Court decisions and opinions and publications, wow, that's bad, right? Of course, I think we can all say, well, we would like to protect that information and make sure that it stays online and viable. But when you start kind of going down the entertainment ladder to things that maybe aren't like government publications, but more purely entertainment, like Comedy Central or like MTV News, there's a school of thought that some people say like, oh, you shouldn't save it all. Like, no, we don't need to save all of this. And I remember, so the MTV News went offline after Paramount pulled the plug on it. And there were people who were saying online, well, it's okay that that disappeared. And I have a completely different view of that, which is, oh my God, it's terrible that these cultural writings, that these music reviews, just all of this stuff that we would interact with on a daily basis, that is the fabric of our digital culture. That is the fabric of our online experience. And I think as long as we have the technology and the server space to store it all, we should, because we don't know what we have. We don't know what we're going to need until that moment that we actually need it. And if we don't preserve it, we can't go back to it. So I say save it all if we can.
Katie, do you maybe want to loop in your work on like women's writing in the early 20th century? I feel like that
Yeah,
it's pretty strongly.
you just read my mind. Yeah. So this is actually, I think that there's a really good parallel to this in physical media and like what we preserve says about what we value, because my general work is in like 19th century, late 19th, early 20th century American women's literature. And I study a lot of short stories as well. And short stories were published in magazines, which very similarly were considered at that time kind of like entertainment waste in a way. Like, because you read a magazine, you kind of sift through it. There's all of this just stuff there that could easily be perceived as white noise. Like, there's advertisements, there were plenty of short stories at the time, there were essays, articles, all kinds of stuff. And it was meant to be read very quickly and then discarded. And this was actually a really prolific time for women writers. They were being widely read, widely published, and paid very well. But then what we see is the US, as we know, kind of falls into this era of conservatism, particularly from like the 30s to 50s. There's this chunk of time in which a lot of this writing is not preserved because it's not considered quote unquote canonical and because women writers are undervalued. And it doesn't get recovered really until the 70s, and like a big movement in libraries and academia to like revalue women's writing. And so there's like a lot of recovery work that happens at that time. But in the process of those things being discarded or like undervalued as, sort of just like it's just entertainment and it's not serious literature, we've lost a lot of stuff and we just don't have copies of certain things anymore. So this is a good example from physical media, I guess.
I'll throw one more in there, and this is just like a example of like high cultural prestige. So there's a couple of lost Shakespeare plays that we know of, for example. So The History of Cardenio is one of them, which is like a remix of Cervantes's Don Quixote. We know that it probably exists because it was entered in the register at the time. But at the time, maybe when people saw it, they were like, oh, we don't really need to preserve this thing. But if somebody were to rediscover that play today, they would be like an academic legend. He would be the most notorious person in the world. And so we have absolutely no idea what might be valuable 10, 100, 1,000 years into the future. So we might as well save it all if we can.
This reminds me of there's this famous case, well, famous if you're a copyright nerd, called Clayton v. Stone, and it was from 1829. And the subject of the lawsuit was about copyright protection of newspapers. And at the time, the Copyright Act said that it protected books, maps, and charts. And it didn't say anything about periodicals or newspapers or magazines or anything like this. And in contrast to the current world where, we give copyright protection to every TikTok video and everything else that gets made, the court did this really probing analysis and was like, well, copyright exists to promote the progress of science. And it had this thing in there where it said the term science cannot, without any propriety, be applied to a work of so fluctuating and fugitive a form as that of a newspaper. And it went on to say, it basically was like, this is like, just stuff that people are talking about. Like, this is not like what we're really here to protect. But the irony of it, of course, is that when we look back at the history of copyright protection and different types of works, it was the stuff that didn't have that monopoly locking it down that actually did get preserved and saved. But this idea that like, well, we only protect the really good stuff, or we only care about like the really good stuff. The idea of what is good and valuable, like, is transitory across time. And I couldn't help but think of the court sitting there and just sort of dismissing the value of newspapers wholesale.
That's an
Yeah.
incredible little bit. I've never heard of this case, and thank you for being a copyright nerd, Dave. Can I throw in one thing really quickly? I want to give one example of like copyright and how it kind of determines the archive and what's accessible today and how it influences my pedagogy as an instructor. So last semester, I taught a class on Black American poetry and poetics from the 20th and 21st century. And in particular, I worked on the Black Arts Movement. And the Black Arts Movement was this amazing flowering of poetry and other forms of media from the early 1960s up to about the 1970s. So all stuff that is still under copyright today. And some of that stuff is available online as skins, but not all of it is. And it's substantially limited the ability of me as a scholar to create a syllabus that's actually representative of the movement. You get like the biggest names, you get like your Amiri Baraka and you get your Gwendolyn Brooks, the people that like most people know about. But there were tons of other poets in this movement that are simply forgotten because their works are under copyright and because they didn't print many copies of these books in the first place. So the movement was all about like small local printing. It was about the circulation of these objects in small communities. And it was about art by and for the people. So it was cheap and it was affordable. But subsequently, it means that these books are only held by a couple of libraries, and they're hesitant to actually scan and upload these books online because there's not really many protections for orphan works, right? Works that are still under copyright protection, but who the rights holder hasn't released those rights, or they can't be contacted for a rights usage, right? And so what it means is that, and I've done some research on this, so I took the entire bibliography of the Broadside Press, which was the most important press of the Black Arts Movement, and I discovered that something like only 7 of the books are still commercially available of the 95 that they published. 30 of those books are hosted on the Internet Archive, thankfully, but that still remains the fact that like 60 to 70% of these books are completely unavailable, and it determines our entire memory and legacy of the Black Arts Movement.
That's a perfect and horrible example of vanishing culture and maybe some of the interventions that we can make as memory institutions in trying to protect it.
Katie, did you want any last words before we wrapped up?
Yeah, just iterating Luca's interest in sort of like small local publications from Black authors. This really great magazine, Fire, it's published during the Harlem Renaissance. It's come into the public domain this year, I believe, right? 26. So yeah, check out Fire and The Joy of Cooking.
And Dave, I'd love to wrap with where we're going. We're excited to do more. And so this summer, we're releasing a podcast, a 6-episode special podcast. So starting on July 1, for 6 weeks, we're going to have an episode featuring one of the essay writers in conversation with a sound artist named Vida, who we brought on to the project to kind of explore this issue of vanishing culture from her own experience as a musician and as a sound engineer. So stay tuned for that. That'll start happening here on the podcast on July 1st. And we're already working on a volume 2. We brought on another scholar. Her name's Aisha Aubrey. She has a completely different point of view, a different perspective on what culture is and what vanishing culture means. And so she's brought together another group of 20 plus essay writers who are looking at different facets, different lenses of these issues around vanishing culture. So hopefully we'll be looking at probably releasing a volume 2 of Vanishing Culture in 2027.
Want to do a round of shout outs? I want to shout out one press in particular that I like called Dead Mall Press. And I want to shout them out because they upload all of the poetry that they publish to the Internet Archive. So you can buy their chapbooks. It's run by one person out of Ohio. His name's R.M. Haynes. Great press, great poetry, and great mission to upload all of this stuff to the Internet Archive.
I want to give a shout out to PM Press. So we didn't get much chance to talk about this, but so how do we solve the issue of vanishing culture? To me, as a librarian, it's let libraries own digital content. Let us actually preserve those PDFs, those EPUBs, those media files that we've talked about here about being gone. Let libraries own those. Let libraries preserve those. And PM Press is a publisher that does something really cool, which is that they sell, not license, not lease, actually sell their digital content to individuals and libraries for preservation. They have an amazing catalog. They do a lot of work with punk rock. So if you have all kinds of weird interest, I can guarantee you that there is something interesting for you at pmpress.org. How do we stop culture from vanishing? It's let libraries own things and make things as open as possible. And so, we just heard it. The stuff that is more open will be preserved over time. So we are releasing the Vanishing Culture book for free. You can read it right now online at the Internet Archive for free. And if you are like me, someone who likes to collect books in print, you can also buy a copy of it. But this is not an either or, it's an and. Both things exist. Both versions of the book exist, and we are happy for that to happen. We wanted an open copy, and we also want to give people a way to collect and own it. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the future of knowledge. Be sure to follow the show. New episodes drop every other Wednesday with bold ideas, fresh insights, and the voices shaping tomorrow.